Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to be part of this very important and strategic conversation about ERF's current and future research agenda. First, I have to say I'm so happy to be here in Kuwait in this most fantastic building under the leadership of a most inspiring man. We're talking about Mr. Abdul Latif Al-Hamad. But I also have to say that as a political scientist, I have lived to see the day when economists become emotional. Yesterday was fantastic. Celebrating with such emotion and passion the community of ERF was a moment for me, coming from the other soft sciences of the social sciences, a moment to remember. You did very well, folks. I go back a long way as a political scientist to consider myself one good, hopefully, citizen of this community, thanks to Hiba Handousa for trusting in the poor soul of a political scientist to dare to engage in conversations with such a wonderful, most distinguished community of economists. I'm not saying that to play cute. I'm saying that because it's real. Interdisciplinarity started with a decision like that to ask the little girl coming back with a PhD from California in political science to come in and sit and listen to what ERF economists were saying back in the mid-90s. And ERF has continued to grow as a key aspirer towards rigorous interdisciplinarity ever since. And this will be a point that will come up in my reactions to Ibrahim's research agenda. Now, the fantastic piece about this research agenda is that, number one, it's huge, and that is an issue of capacity, but also an issue of focus and an issue of prioritization. The other fantastic thing about this research agenda is it is so filled with rich, good intentions. The question is how to make sure we do not get lost in the daily operation of each single piece of this agenda, because this agenda will be operationalized into research projects. And once that happens, the rubber hits the road, and when the rubber hits the road, each project becomes a project. And this richness of good intentions needs someone to guard it, and to guard it like a lioness. Otherwise, the rubber will hit the road, and it will turn into a multiplicity of research projects. Let me give you an example. I looked at that list, and I said, now I'm tempted to add more topics to this list, especially that Ibrahim was so generous and courageous and said, Noha, see if there is anything else you would like to add to this list from a non-economist perspective. So the temptation was there big time. So I said, I'm missing the China factor. I'm all about the China factor these days, right? I'm missing the China factor. Yes, it's about free zones and ports that the Chinese are building in our region, and some work in oil and gas and all the rest of it. But there is more to the China factor than just that. China is a huge consumer of natural resources, of which we have in abundance. China is a huge interested global player in geostrategically located regions. MENA has a lot of that geostrategicness in it. Sometimes I consider it God's curse, but that's another story. China is a distorter of prices. China is maybe also a distorter of job markets. China is a meddler in governments' abilities to serve the future generations, because our choices now in dealing with China could possibly mean indebtedness for future generations and limitation of their choices. That's the Africa story, at least they tell us. And China is also a model that emboldens national governance practices. Not all of them are good. And China is also a player that might shift or change global governance practices. We know little about that. We know little about how it will happen and when it will happen. This is all China, besides free zones and ports and oil and gas as it manifests itself in our region. But when I heard Ibrahim, I realized he's aware of all that. The ERF team is aware of all that. How much will that, of that will come to dominate the narrative that will come out of any work we do on China is still a question mark, and an issue of capacity as well. I could go on and on and on in this way, but I think to be smart and use my time properly and wisely to be useful to ERF and ERF's research agenda, I want to talk about three things very quickly, if I possibly can, that are all embedded in ERF's agenda. But again, embedded is not enough. How much we want to consciously lift up those issues, that's a question I leave with you. Those three issues are, one, people-centered economics, and not growth-centered economics only. Two, new social contracts that impact upon economics. And three, the bigger narrative above economics. On people-centered economics, I say that we hear there are sectors driving the economies of the Middle East. I don't hear how much jobs are being created in those sectors and how decent are the jobs created in those sectors. And decency is not only income, decency is social protection. But Ibrahim told us that this is a very important piece of their story. But it's a piece that is not only in conflict countries, it's a piece that cuts across all the precarity of jobs in the Middle East. And with precarity, let me tell you, we know it from the north, the global north. With precarity will come more nationalism and more populism and more fear and hatred-driven policies. We know that already for a fact. So precarity has to be taken seriously, economically and otherwise. Second point, the new social contract. Again, as I said earlier, the research agenda of ERF is so rich that even the concept social contract was not missing in Ibrahim's presentation. And I'm sure it's not missing in his heart either, or the heart of the ERF research teams. However, I would like you to think a bit deeper about many of the topics on the research agenda from a social contract perspective. I'll give you quickly two examples. Urbanization. Cities in the Arab region, we are told, are drivers of growth. But every single social scientist, other than economists, who looks at cities in the Arab world sees drivers of inequality. And this has a lot to do with how elites are planning to deal with urban citizens, how elites are afraid of urban citizens, because urban citizenry means street protests. And this is a social contract that needs to be set right and set straight. Artificial intelligence and automation. People tell us drivers of growth. Yes, they are, but they are also, could also be drivers of atomization of citizens. Every one of us is sitting behind this thing, getting business done, hopping on a shared platform and getting myself a job, opening a website and getting myself the merchandise that I used to go to the supermarket for before, etc., etc. What does atomization do? It reduces a very important concept in political science that enables stable social contracts. What is that concept? Representation. What does that mean? Collective action. We need to realize whether atomization of work and of citizenry is going to eat up into that backbone of stable social contracts, namely representation and collective action. And my final issue that I think cuts across a lot of what you do and needs to be lifted up is the narrative. I love my economist colleagues when they tell their students, don't only do number crunching, think about the story. What is the story you're telling? It is so right and true that it's beyond numbers, it's the story. And one good story you heard this morning. Thank you, Land Pritchett, for putting numbers up there to tell a different story. We might disagree with the methodology, we might disagree with the assumptions, we might disagree with all sorts of technical things about Land Pritchett's intervention this morning. But he made us sit up at the edge of our chairs, didn't he? This moment where you dispel a big narrative is a valuable moment because it allows you to just go back and do some number testing to check on your calculations after somebody has given us a slap on and said, look at the reality with a different lens. This is the big narrative. Another example of a big narrative with a slap on the face is Joseph Stiglitz's narrative when he said, what is this old-fashionable curiosity and hype about high net worth individuals, billionaires, giving to reduce poverty? And he said his most famous phrase, we cannot business ourselves out of poverty. What was this slap on the face about? It wasn't a slap on the face of billionaires. They still should go ahead and do social enterprise and help us out. But the slap on the face was about poverty, and mostly inequality behind poverty are government responsibilities, and you cannot wash them away with individual charities or even social entrepreneurship, because they are about government choices, not technical failures and accidents. A powerful narrative is an interdisciplinary narrative. And interdisciplinary narratives are costly exercises. What do they cost? Not just money, but mostly nerves, patience, and time. Ziya Khan, the vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation, has written a blog lately, which I really like very much, and I'd like to share with you some of its thoughts on this idea of interdisciplinarity, but he called disciplinary integration. And he wanted us to think about integration as fusion. And he said the following. He argued that integration is overcoming the tensions between different interests to realize a better solution, but without resorting to compromise. And he says it takes persistent and often frustrating work to overcome these tensions and realize the benefits of all the disciplines represented around the table that you are trying to integrate. He says, don't create hyphenated concepts and disciplines and think good will happen. Don't hyphenate artificial intelligence and good healthcare and good will happen. Don't hyphenate artificial intelligence and workforce development and good will happen. It needs fusion. And he said, consider this physics analogy of fusion. Achieving nuclear fusion requires enough energy to be applied in a confined space until atomic nuclei overcome the forces keeping them apart. And those nuclei fuse together, releasing extraordinary amounts of energy. Similarly, we need to apply patience, perseverance, time, and some money to get fields that are naturally apart to overcome their goals, techniques, and cultural differences and fuse into something else without compromising rigor. I'm coming to the end by saying, what's the how around all this? How can ERF, as a fantastic community of rigorous researchers, how can it achieve interdisciplinarity in the best possible ways, achieve impact in the best possible ways, and most importantly, guard its independence in the most possible ways? Very quickly, I am giving you some of my telegraphic lessons that we are learning at the Ford Foundation after having been supporters of at least 10 regional networks in the MENA region in the past 10 years. On the issue of interdisciplinarity, we see that some of the regional networks in the Arab region do it in-house by including fellows from other disciplines into their network, or they do it not in-house, but by building partnerships with other networks in the region that are doing different things. I see ERF doing a little bit of both, and it's the right direction to take to mix those two solutions, either by accepting fellows who are not economists or reaching out for networks in the Arab region that are doing different things. And as Ibrahim mentioned earlier, the work on post-conflict reconstruction is a fantastic place where partnerships with other networks in the region doing that is really, truly a potential for good interdisciplinarity work. Impact. How can ERF measure impact? And here I tell you, please watch out for your assumptions. How are you measuring impact has a lot to do with your assumptions. Are you assuming, for instance, that impact is when other researchers read and cite what you have written? Then the action point will be follow up with tools that help you trace who is quoting whom and where. But if you are assuming that the impact is when policymakers read and listen, the action point is, I don't know how often they do that, but the action point is follow up on what they're reading and attribute some of what they are doing to something you've written or you've said. But there is assumption number 3. Data, trend analysis, and capacity trainings improve processes of policy, and that is impact. If so, then your action point is to follow up on how much you're increasing the numbers of data sets, you're increasing the training workshops of policymakers and the like. Here, I would like to ask you to add another assumption to that impact measurement equation. The assumption I want you to add, to consider, is policy is a result of dominant mindsets and dominant narratives. The action point here would be, how can we measure our impact on dominant narratives with respect to growth, with respect to jobs, with respect to precarity, etc., etc. If we can help rattle the houses of big narratives that condone inequality and discrimination, then you're achieving a lot of impact. Finally, and how do you do that without endangering one fantastic value asset of ERF, its independence? And here is another how question. Is independence, I understand as non-partisan rigor, the same as value neutral? Is non-partisanship value neutral? I venture to say that's a challenge that all regional networks in the Arab world are facing right now. How can you remain rigorous to be asked and invited to come to the table, but at the same time, not be value neutral? And the values here are values of diversity, inclusion, respect for the other, fair distribution of resources, etc., etc. As a philanthropy, and I'm closing up, Mr. Chairman, as a philanthropy, we like to think of ourselves as a strategic donor that celebrates reflective, critical thinking, not only success stories. As ERF, you are a community of solidarity and mutual respect without compromising rigor nor diversity. I cannot think of any other community that is well poised to be a critically reflecting network, a disruptor of harmful narratives that condone inequality, and I cannot wait to see the next 25 years of continued success. You are a fantastic team. Thank you.